Let's make sure it's okay. I think I've got that ready to go. We'll check in just a minute. And yeah, you're all back online. Okay, great. Welcome to Wednesday night. Sorry about that little hiccup. Yeah, I hope you've all had a chance to look at the prayer list and make a note of someone you're going to reach out to this week from the list, either by phone or text or card or email, something that you'll do to let them know that we are keeping them in our prayers. I just want to check something real quick, make sure we're... Right. Yeah, we're still going. Okay. Great. Well, why don't we pray together and then we'll get started with our program. Gracious God, we thank you for the privilege we have of being a family together. Lord, it has been a long season being apart, and we long for the days when we can safely gather back together. But until those days come, we ask that you would help us to use every means possible to stay in touch with one another, to continue to strengthen the bond that we have in your Spirit. Lord, we pray for wisdom and courage. We pray for all those who are working hard to stop the pandemic and to heal those who are sick. Lord, we pray for your peace. It's in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. Well, tonight I'm going to share a childhood interview about our childhood with our very own Daryl Eccles. So, without further ado, here's Daryl. Let's make sure it's okay. I think we're going. So, obviously, I'm here with Daryl Eccles to talk about his childhood. Thank you for doing this. So, tell me a little bit about where you grew up, either the house, the city, your room. What kind of stands out about your your place, your setting as a child?
Okay, let me preface my remarks by saying that your early childhood doesn't have to define who you are for the rest of your life. So, um,
Yes,
I
that's true.
often tell people that my life really didn't begin probably until my sophomore year in college. So most of my remarks and most of my responses to your questions will be just sort of where I came from, that
Sure.
sort of thing.
Yeah, no, that's great.
So I was born in Dallas, Texas in 1949. I grew up in West Dallas. And if any listeners or watchers are familiar with Dallas, they'll know that Inwood Road is a very long north-south running road. And to the west of Inwood is sort of the wrong side of the tracks. And if you travel east from Inwood Road, you run into Highland Park and University Park and the very wealthy neighborhoods. Well, I was born on the west side of Inwood, so I was born on the wrong side of the tracks. Um, but my earliest childhood home was just west of the intersection of Lovers Lane and Inwood, close
Okay.
to the Inwood Shopping Center, which was one of the very first um, suburban strip shopping centers in the country. Actually, it was built in the early 1940s. Um, and it was the site of the old Inwood Theater, which I'll refer to later on too. Um, but anyway, that was my first childhood home. My parents, um, I was an only child. My parents were both alcoholics. Um, I never saw them as an early child. I never saw them argue or fight or anything. So it came as quite a surprise when I was about 5 or 6 that they actually divorced. I was in kindergarten at the time. I was probably 6 because I went to a private school in kindergarten that had kindergarten and first grade And I began in kindergarten there at this little school that it was in a residential home in a neighborhood not too very far from mine. And I can remember that they divorced during that year when I was in school. And I started when I was in kindergarten when I was 5, and we used to call it double promoting. They double promoted me into first grade about halfway through. So I turned 6 in January. And at the end of that year, I actually finished first grade. So it was during that year that my parents divorced. The only thing that I remember that stood out about that first home was that we had a peach tree in the backyard that I used to love to climb. It was right in the center of the backyard. And it was a perfect climbing tree. I lived there till, like I say, till my parents were divorced. And so I would climb that tree, and during peach season, I would climb up and pick fresh peaches off the tree. And it probably wasn't what you were supposed to do. You're probably supposed to wash peaches and everything before you ate them. But I'd pick peaches right out of the tree and eat them. And it was a kind of a heavenly thing to do in a rotten neighborhood.
Yeah.
But anyway, my parents divorced, and my mother moved to a small duplex a few blocks away. And it was further west, further toward Love Field, the airport. That was the only airport in Dallas at the time. And we were just almost walking distance to Love Field. So this was a little bit closer even to Love Field than the first house. And it was a small little duplex, and it was the sort of neighborhood where, people parked their cars in the front yard, and there was trash everywhere, and, it was pretty slummy. But anyway, we lived there until I was in about the 3rd grade. And then my mother while I was living in the duplex, it was close enough that actually I could walk back and forth between my father's house, where I was living as an early child, as an infant, and I could walk between that house and my mother's duplex. I was with my mother during the weekdays every week, and was with my father every weekend, was their arrangement. And I don't remember them ever driving me back and forth between the houses. I just walked back and forth between the houses,
Right.
at the beginning and end of the weekend. And then in about the 3rd grade, my mother moved all the way across Dallas to the northeast side of Dallas. And we lived in that house from 3rd grade until I graduated from high school and left Dallas. So I was in that house for a number of years. And it was just it was a small 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom house, had 1 window unit air conditioner in it, which was in the living room. So it was hard to cool the house.
Yeah.
This was, and we had those little space heaters that you just plug in, portable space heaters that you could just plug in any room in the house. So my room was on the back of my bedroom was on the back of the house, and I had a north facing window above my bed that I kept open just about all year long, kept open to keep cool in the summertime. And I was a weather freak and loved weather and loved storms and loved the snow. So I would leave the window open even when it was snowing. It would snow in just literally through the screen onto my bed, in the wintertime. And I'd have my space heater next to the bed to keep warm and all cuddled up.
Yeah.
But anyway, we lived there until, like I say, all the way through grade school until I graduated from high school. And again, I was there weekdays with my mother. And then my mother would drive me across town to my father's place. He since moved into an apartment, and she would drive me over there every Friday afternoon. And I would stay with my father until Sunday afternoon, and he would drive me back to mother's place every Sunday afternoon, except for Wednesdays. Every Wednesday, my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, my mother's mother, would pick me up from grade school, take me to her house. And she had a little neighborhood Bible study, a children's Bible study with little neighborhood kids and me. And she had one of these flannel graph. I don't know whether people now even know what those
Yes.
are. Those
Yeah.
flannel graph boards, where you'd have the cutout and the painted figures and little sets and things. She would
Right.
tell Bible stories on these flannel graph things to all these little neighborhood kids every Wednesday afternoon. And we would go to prayer meeting at their church on Wednesday evening. And then my mother would either pick me up Wednesday nights and bring me back home, or my grandmother would take me the next morning to school. So that was our routine.
Yeah.
So weekdays with mother, Wednesday nights with my grandparents, and weekends with my father. And my mother would take me to school every morning, to grade school. And it was about 2 miles away, probably, from the house. And then I would walk home from school every afternoon of my life from school, and come home to an empty house. And it seemed normal at the time for me, but
Right.
Came home and watched TV, and just kind of entertained myself until my mother would come home in the evening. She worked, got home about between 6 and 7, probably, in the evenings. She would mix herself a drink or two and start fixing dinner. And we usually didn't eat dinner until 8 or 9 at night, every night. I would have usually done my homework by then. So I went to bed shortly after I ate supper every night.
Yeah. Wow. Well, what's a game or activity that you were doing when you were most happy as a child?
Well, I don't remember having many games at all.
Mm-hmm.
I could count the number of games that I had, probably on one hand. I remember that toys, well, I had a Chutes and Ladders game. I think every household had a Chutes and Ladders game at some point.
Yeah.
A board game. Used to play that. But when I would come home in the afternoons, at about 3 or 4, we had one station there in Dallas, Channel 11. Actually, it was a Fort Worth station. It was not the ABC, NBC, or CBS affiliate, but it was a locally owned station.
Mm-hmm.
And every afternoon they would show old movies. And so I would often come home, unlock the house, go in, and after school, I would start watching these old vintage 30s, 40s, and 50s movies.
Nice.
In the afternoons, these old, Clark Gable and Jimmy Stewart, Olivia de Havilland, Greer Garson, all these old classic movies. And so I could just sort of lose myself in these movies, in the afternoons. And toys, I remember getting a Lionel train one year for Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember getting a telescope one year for Christmas, which I don't know that either one of those would classify in most people's minds as being childhood toys. But my parents, bless their hearts, my parents really weren't wired, to be parents, I think. So they didn't really, they didn't know how to entertain a child. So I just, I entertained myself a lot and find ways to find amusement other than with standard childhood toys and games and things like that. But it all worked out.
Yeah.
But Dallas was a wonderful place. You asked a question on there. I don't know whether it was where you grew up shaped you, or
yes.
what was. Yeah, one thing about that was that Dallas, of course, is a large city. It wasn't a small town experience growing up like some of the people that you've already interviewed. So it was already kind of an isolating experience. And I already felt sort of isolated being an only child and from, divorced parents and so forth. But the schools were large. The schools were excellent schools. They were not integrated at the time. This was back in the 1950s. Mm-hmm. But there were a lot of cultural opportunities in Dallas, and my parents both took me as often as they could, and I'm sure it was costly even then to do it, so they didn't do it very often. But my mother used to take me to uh, some of the Dallas summer musicals at State Fair Music Hall.
Mhm.
And I would see entertainers like Jane Powell and Carol Burnett, Judy Garland, some real legendary people in
Yeah.
that time. And my father was a big lover of opera for some reason. It seemed kind of out of character for him, but he loved opera. And he had season tickets for the Dallas Opera on about the sixth row in the orchestra section downstairs in the music hall.
Uh-huh.
And we would go see Maria Callas and Joan Sutherland and these legendary opera divas, from the 1950s that
Wow.
he had records that we would listen to. And I can remember some of the earliest childhood memories as being in the music hall, that when you went to the opera and sitting that close to the stage, there was a certain smell of the stage sets and the props and everything, the
Uh-huh.
scenery. There was a kind of smell that you could smell from that close, that the opera was grand and the music was fantastic, and it was all an overwhelming experience for a child. But the thing that I remember the most, aside from the gorgeous voices and the sweeping music and everything, was the smell of the sets, which is an odd thing. And I don't know whether other people have experienced that or not, but I don't remember that in any other setting except going to the opera. And
Was it kind of a fresh paint smell, or can you describe it?
I really can't describe it.
Okay.
It might have been a fresh paint smell, but it was probably these large, grand staging sets, that they toured with.
Yeah.
Some of them might have been built on site. I don't know, but I'm guessing that a lot of these things were things that they toured with, and they probably moved in vans, from city to city.
Yeah.
And they sort of had a smell that it wasn't an unpleasant smell or anything, but it was just
Unique.
something that just affects your sensory perception that you remember for the rest of your life. And really, people say that smell is one of a lot of people associate that with kitchen smells, when they from their youth. But this was a smell memory that stayed with me for all my life.
That's great.
But both of my parents loved music. I had a great appreciation for music for an early age, from an early time in my life. Both of my parents had really great record collections.
All different kinds of music?
Yes, a pretty wide selection of music. My mother had a lot of, this was the 1950s, and jazz was real popular, piano jazz. She liked jazz. I wasn't crazy about that even as a child, and not too crazy about it now, but she did have classical music, and she had one particular album that was compositions by Grieg and Sibelius, both Scandinavian composers. Sibelius, of course, wrote Finlandia, which in our hymnal is Be Still My Soul.
Yes.
And actually, Finlandia is the national anthem for Finland. That was Sibelius. And on the same record, there were selections that were written by Grieg, Edvard Grieg, who was a Norwegian composer. And one of the pieces, all of these pieces on the album were like 5 minutes. They were not long orchestral pieces. But one of my favorite pieces of Grieg was Wedding Day at Trollhagen. And that's not as familiar a melody as Finlandia is to most people. But I love this piece. And, these old record albums, you could pick up the arm and the needle, and you could just replay, kind of like repeat. You could just play the songs over and over again. And I would listen to this record album for hours on end, particularly these two songs.
Nice.
And my mother had a Judy Garland album that was a live performance at Carnegie Hall back in the 60s. And it was essentially the same concert that she did on tour when I saw her in Dallas at the State Fair Music Hall. So between Judy Garland and these classical music pieces and listening to opera records that my father had, I had a really big dose of music as a youngster. So I really grew to appreciate it.
Right.
And when I was living in the first two houses before I moved across town, when I was living in the first two houses in early grade school, the Inwood Theater that I mentioned before was just probably about a mile from our house.
Uh-huh.
And they had in that day, I don't know whether they had them in Waco, but in the big cities, they had Saturday morning kids shows at a lot of the suburban theaters. And for 25 cents, I would leave in the morning on Saturday morning every weekend of my life nearly. And I would walk to the Inwood Theater with my quarter and see they had several cartoons, and then they would have a full-length movie that was kind of aimed to children. It was either a Disney movie or something that was geared for kids.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you wanted to, you could stay and watch whatever movie the Inwood Theater was showing that week. So,
Oh, wow.
you can make a whole day out of it for a quarter if you wanted to. But there were a lot of, I saw a lot of, they had science fiction movies and things, that would appeal to youngsters at the time, but it was a lot of fun. And the Inwood Theater was fascinating to me. It was close by. Mm-hmm. It was built in the 40s, and it was one of these, it wasn't like the big movie palace that was downtown or something, but it was a large neighborhood theater. It had a balcony and had a beautiful winding staircase that went from the lobby up to the second floor in the lobby, a second floor balcony. But and the Inwood Theater, again, some of the people that are familiar with Dallas will know the Inwood because of its history. It was where the Sound of Music first ran in Dallas and ran for 2 years continuously at the Inwood Theater. So it was really a famous theater, and it's still open. It's not a single screen theater anymore. They did one of those numbers where, they made a theater out of the downstairs, and then they twinned the balcony. And so it's 3 theaters now, but it still operates.
Cool.
And it's still, like I say, it's on the good side of Inwood Road. So it's a popular place for Highland Park and University Park people to go to still.
Have you been back as an adult?
Yeah. I've been back there a couple of times, and they used to show, for a while, they were one of the art film theaters that would show foreign films and things, independent films.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing A Room with a View at the Inwood. Cool. And but it was so neat because it had one of those huge marquees out in front of it, where they would actually change the letters and everything of the movies that were running. And it had these huge tower on the top of it that had fantastic neon lights. It's amazing. And if somebody ever has a chance to go to Dallas and go to a movie, they ought to go to the Inwood Theater just to experience the theater.
Cool.
A lot of fun.
That explains a lot about your love of music and movies.
That's right. Goes way back.
Yeah.
And of course, Fantasia here behind me. Fantasia was probably the first movie that I can ever remember seeing as a child. It came out in 1940, and I was born in 49, so it predates me even.
Right.
But they re-released it a number of times during my childhood, so I saw it in the movie theater the first time, and it was perfect music movie for me because it had grand classical music, and it had Mickey the Sorcerer, Sorcerer's Apprentice. And now here I'm sitting in my shrine of Mickey the Sorcerer collection and Fantasia paraphernalia and stuff. So it's a lifelong memory.
Absolutely.
But it was a fun thing because I could sort of, instead of toys and games, I could sort of lose myself in music, listening to records and watching movies with my parents. And that sort of took the place, I think, largely of games and toys. And being an only child, you didn't really have the interaction with a sibling to do things with anyhow.
Right.
And my parents were not into playing games or playing toys. They didn't really know how to entertain a child. So, I just took that on as my own initiative.
Well, what's so I mean, you kind of answered like the about the toys, and what's something that gave you comfort as a child?
Well, obviously music music gave me great comfort.
Yeah.
Um, there was some, I could sort of live vicariously through some of the TV shows and movies that I saw as a youngster.
Uh-huh.
Back in the 50s, all the sitcoms on TV were things like Lassie, um, Leave It to Beaver. They were family shows. They were all black and white, just family sitcoms. But I could sort of imagine myself being Timmy, with his dog Lassie.
Yeah.
I can enjoy and imagine myself to be uh, the Jerry Mathers character and Leave It to Beaver with an older brother, Wally,
Right.
and Spencer's Mountain, the Waltons. I just love these family stories because they were something that I couldn't identify with, but I could sort of, live vicariously through these stories and these characters.
Yeah.
And that gave me comfort as a child. Plus the music is still comforting to me now. I mean,
Right.
music is a great comforter.
Well, what's something that you remember learning as a child?
Oh, as a child, I learned to normalize your circumstances and normalize your situation, to make the best of a situation, like living in two households and bouncing back and forth between, two single parents every week. I learned a lot from movies. Some things that I probably didn't necessarily need to know. Movies back in the 50s, there was no sex or bad language or anything that
Right.
would make it inappropriate. But my parents did take me to see some things that were not age appropriate simply because of the theme of the movie or something. I can remember in the late 50s, there were a couple of movies that my mother took me to see. In particular, one was On the Beach. I don't know whether you ever saw On the Beach. Growing up in the 50s and during the Cold War era, after the end of World War II and before the Vietnam War, the Cold War era was that time when all of us thought that on any day of the week that, the Russians and the United States could be dropping atomic bombs on each other. And, we had these bomb drills, like fire drills at school. We'd have bomb drills, these duck and cover things where they'd sound this alarm and you'd duck underneath your desk as if that would do anything, if you had an atomic bomb.
Right.
But they were even, in the Coliseum and the Civic Center in Dallas, they would have car shows. Everybody would go see brand new cars every year. They also had fallout shelter shows, and they would actually have exhibits where people would go and look at and buy in-ground fallout shelters during this time.
Wow.
During the Cold War. Well, this is just lays the predicate. Anyway, this movie On the Beach came out in 1959. Terrific movie. Gregory Peck, Ava Gardner, Fred Astaire, Anthony Perkins, good cast. But it was about the world right after a global nuclear war, after nuclear annihilation, and the only left surviving on the planet were in Australia. So this was a story. Gregory Peck was a commander of a submarine, and they were sailing from the United States to Australia because Australia, he was, with his crew, was underwater. So they were safe from the fallout as long as they were underwater. And they went to Australia because these were the last people that hadn't been affected by the fallout. Well, it was only a matter of time before they would die too. Well, I saw this movie, and it's a fantastic movie, and it probably wouldn't have the same effect if you saw it today as if you had lived through the 1950s and actually lived through times when you thought that this was a real possibility.
Right.
And it had a very strong impact. It gave me nightmares, when I saw the movie. And I'm sure that my parents didn't, they didn't intentionally inflict that on me. It was just kind of part of the age that we lived in.
Yeah.
And also, my mother took me to see a movie called I Want to Live with Susan Hayward.
Uh-huh.
Came out in the late 50s. Um, Susan Hayward won the Academy Award for Best Actress for that movie, by the way. But and she played a prostitute, which that kind of went over my head at the time. But
Right.
But she was accused of murder, and she defended herself and claimed her innocence until her death, and they sentenced her to death in the gas chamber. And if you talk to anybody else that's ever seen this movie, they will tell you that what they remember, if nothing else, about the movie was that the final 10 minutes or so is a very clinical and a very graphic depiction of getting the gas chamber ready for her death and her execution in the gas chamber.
Whoa.
I had nightmares about that movie for months and months.
Yeah.
And again, it was a great movie, but it was not a movie for a 9-year-old to see.
Right.
Because, I just had this horrible mental image. There's certain things that you just can't unsee.
Right.
And I still to this day have this nauseating image of somebody dying very slowly and sort of peacefully, but in a gas chamber after seeing this movie.
That's awesome.
So anyway, but there were other movies I saw during the same period that were, I learned a lot about history and everything, like The Diary of Anne Frank. And I thought, my plight as, an only child from a broken home, it wasn't nearly as bad as, growing up during the Holocaust era, being a Jewish family, hiding out in Amsterdam in the attic. And I remember watching that movie as a child, and it was traumatic watching it, because it was just a scary thing to see, and knowing that it was real, that people were actually living through this kind of experience. But it was such a memorable thing, because last year actually was the year that we were finally able to go to Amsterdam, and we went to the Anne Frank house there in Amsterdam, and I was actually able to walk through this hidden staircase behind the bookcase, where you went up the stairs into the attic, and where the two Jewish families were hiding, and into the far attic upstairs, where Anne Frank and her boyfriend Peter would go and talk with each other to kind of get away from everybody else and have a little bit of privacy.
Right.
And they had this open skylight window that they could look out, because they couldn't look out any other windows, because they would be found and seen. Right. So they had and a lot of people have probably seen The Diary of Anne Frank, so they know what I'm talking about. But as I was walking through this, I had these mental images from childhood of watching this movie and these characters, living that experience. And I'm thinking, here I am in this very place in Amsterdam where they were hiding out for all these years, knowing that they probably weren't going to get out alive. And I think only her father, was the only survivor of the Holocaust, because Anne Frank and her boyfriend and most of the rest of the family, died in the concentration camps after they were discovered there in the hiding place. So that was quite an experience. Yeah. And thinking back to that wedding day at Trollhagen, the Grieg piece that I love so much, 2 summers ago, it was a real emotional experience to actually go see Grieg's hometown of Trollhagen, Norway, and walked through his house and saw his little music studio in a small little building on his property that was down by the lake just below his house.
Wow.
And I just stood there walking through that and thinking, this is where this composer actually sat, and composed all this gorgeous music that meant so much to me as a child. And, here I am walking, where he walked around his house and through his house and into his music studio. And it was just his music studio was right by the lakeside. It's just a gorgeous setting, but it was like a 10 by 12 building, just like a little outbuilding or something.
Right.
But he had a piano out there as well as a piano in his house. So he was, that was his place where he composed music.
That's cool.
So it's a fascinating thing. So it's a great connection to have some of these early childhood memories of places and music and things that you would make that connection later on in your life to see the actual location of where these things took place.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And you mentioned pets. I need to mention that from infancy, we had a dog named Chloe,
Uh-huh.
who was, my friend and companion as an early child. And I was around adults, hardly around other children. So I was mostly around adults when they had social settings. But my parents, even into adulthood, would remind me that when I was sitting there, with nothing to say, no way to enter the conversation, that I would just interject, well, what do y'all think about Chloe? I would just talk about this dog. I thought, I don't know what to talk about except my dog.
Right, right.
So I just asked everybody, well, what do you think about Chloe? And then later on in grade school, after we moved to the other side of town, my best Christmas present of all was a little beagle named Roger. And Roger became sort of my brother, my sibling, my companion, my best friend.
Yeah.
And like I say, my mother would take me to school every morning, and then I would walk a couple of miles home from school every afternoon. And Roger would dig under the fence. We couldn't keep him from doing this. We did everything in the world to keep him from doing it, but he prevailed anyway. He would dig under the fence every day and go, I don't know where during the daytime, but he would always, at about 3:30 in the afternoon, always be sitting in the front driveway waiting to greet me when I walked home from school every day.
Oh, that is so cool.
Yeah, it's a wonderful memory. So I have close attachments to pets,
Yeah.
and actually friends. I didn't really I had acquaintances at school and grade school, and I'm confining this discussion mainly to grade school.
Mm-hmm.
I had hardly any friends in grade school other than just, classmate acquaintances, because I walked home every day. There was an empty house, so I couldn't invite anybody over.
Yeah.
And then on the weekends, I was cross town with my father, so I really couldn't invite anybody over there either. So my cousins, my first cousins that lived in Dallas, were actually my closest friends, surrogate friends and siblings. And I was sort of farmed out to cousins and their families a lot of times. So that was sort of my friendships,
Yeah.
as an early child.
Well, what was one of your greatest mysteries?
Oh, goodness. Well, for a while, I used to wonder why my life was so different from all the people that I saw in these sitcoms on television.
Yeah.
Of course, that wasn't too hard to figure out, but sometimes I wondered why my mother and her two brothers ran away from home as soon as they turned 18 and could get away from house. And I finally figured out that it was because my grandmother, the one that picked me up every Wednesday and had these Bible studies, in her living room every Wednesday afternoon with the neighborhood kids.
Yeah.
She was our theologian, our Christian matriarch, my Bible teacher. I really didn't go to Sunday school ever in my life until I was an adult. So this was my Sunday school initiation, my Bible study initiation.
Yeah.
But she was so judgmental and so narrow and rigid. Everything was sinful to her. Like I say, going to movies was sin. Going to school dances was sinful. So with my mother being an alcoholic, I'm sure there was a lot of tension there. So,
yeah.
But I finally figured out that it was just this suffocating, atmosphere and rigidity that caused my mother and her siblings to leave and get out of the house as quickly as they could after they were adults and had the ability to do so, because they just felt so stifled. Everything that they did was sinful. Yeah. And they thought, find somewhere else to send.
Right. Right. uh,
But it was a struggle to kind of find your way out of isolation and finding a way um, to understand, what life is all about. And like I say, it was only later on that I learned that life doesn't always reach out to you. Sometimes you have to reach out to life. And I discovered that as a sophomore in college.
yeah.
And that was a turn of events. That's another discussion for another time. But anyway, that's where I came from and what my formative years was like. But again, there are happy endings. So I don't want everybody to think that was, it seemed bleak at the time, but it seemed normal. It was what I was accustomed to. So
Yeah.
it's something you take in stride and make the best of. And you learn a lot of life lessons from it and move on and try not to make some of the same mistakes that you saw happening around you.
Were you a big reader as a child?
I read some.
Okay.
English was my field, and I loved grammar. I loved
Right.
sentences. I loved words. I loved. I don't know whether you remember diagramming sentences. We used to diagram sentences when we learned parts of speech and grammar in grade school.
Uh-huh.
And one of my pastimes was writing the longest, most complicated sentences that I could conceive and sit there and diagram them on paper. I used to do that for fun. I mean,
Yeah.
how much
That
of
was
a nerd
part of our
was that?
detention when I was in grade school.
I mean, some people, really get into math and they see the beauty of math and
Yeah.
really get into that. And I was really into sentence structure and communication and language.
Yeah.
So
That's
I confess that I wasn't a big reader, but I did enjoy the language. I enjoyed the way language was structured.
And
And
the art of words too.
I fancied myself as, had aspirations of being a writer, kind of like you've mentioned before too.
Yeah.
Either being a writer or meteorologist when I grew up, because I was a weather fanatic as well. But neither one of those actually happened. But as you say, there's life after your childhood aspirations. So sometimes you go a different path.
That's true.
And it turns out just fine.
Yeah. You turned out remarkably well.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It's very kind.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for doing this. I appreciate you sharing your story with us.
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity.